Welcome to another cross-border talk, where we continue with our interest towards Southeastern Europe and its politics. Where we hosting today Bașak Alpan, who is a professor of the Middle Eastern Technical University in Ankara, and she's very knowledgeable on the issues of Europeanization and relations of Turkey with the region, especially the Balkans. And we'll be asking her exactly in these domains about what has been going on in general in the first part of the talk with Turkey's modernization and Europeanization, and in the second part we'll be dealing with the international relations and a bit also with Turkish politics, where we see a certain move after the elections of Erdogan to the west. First question will be put by my colleague Veronica Sushova-Salminen.
Hello, everybody, and I will start with the question related to the phenomenon of Europeanization of Turkey, and in general, this is a very large topic related to the European Union and its institutional processes. So maybe because our guest is really specialist for this topic, I would like to first ask, and I know it's very difficult and complex question, not only because Turkey is one of the longest time waiting for the kind of candidacy to the European Union, how to define the Europeanization process in relation to Turkey and its specific status, and how would you evaluate the current status of Europeanization process in Turkey?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to see you. Well, I know that the term Europeanization is currently very catchy, and it's like it even emerges as a buzzword. But regarding Turkey, Europeanization is usually understood in order to denote the period after 1963 Ankara Agreement, when Turkey had become an associate, applied for associate membership with the EU. Not full membership, but an associate membership. But Europeanization story regarding Turkey is dating back to the late 18th century and 19th century in the Ottoman Empire, right? So because in the last eras of the Ottoman Empire, it had the term Europe has mainly been associated with the Westernization attempts of the Ottoman Empire, and especially after many territories were lost, starting from the 17th century. The Ottoman Empire started initiating these modernization attempts. It mainly overlapped with the term Europeanization, in terms of restructuring the army, restructuring of some policies like taxation, etc. And this kind of continued with the Republic of Turkey as well, because when Turkish Republic had been established in 1923, the main orientation of the republic was Europe. So after the proclamation of the Republic, the Europeanization attempts had mainly emerged at three different levels. As a foreign policy discourse, right? The direction of the Republic was basically with the Western world. As a civilizational discourse, with Atatürk's words, it was, Turkey saw itself together with the countries which emerged as the cradle of civilization, and as a policy-based discourse. Especially after the Ankara Agreement of 1963, Europe increasingly started penetrating into the domestic policies. So in this respect, I guess we need to be thinking about Turkey's Europeanization from a broader perspective, which could be traced back to the late Ottoman Empire as well.
Regarding this, maybe it's interesting because Turkey is very near to Russia in a way, in this, that Russia was also trying to modernize, and both countries, I think, were trying to modernize also because they want to compete with the West in a way. So there was always this kind of dimension. But with Erdogan, current president of the Turkey, we hear more often that his, and now not only in the domestic policy, but also within the foreigner political dimension, he is doing something what some call as de-Europeanization. It means that he is or he was consciously turning the Turkey towards from Europe towards countries like China, towards Middle East, of course, where Turkey has always important position, and towards Russia. So is there something like the Europeanization, and how to actually explain or interpret this process if there is such process?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Well, I mean, to start with, the Europeanization has emerged as a catchy concept quite recently as well, and it mainly denotes to this process where the quality of integration and the emergence of Europe as a context decreases and depreciates. And in case of Turkey, the Europeanization has usually been taken as a process where Turkey deviated from the EU ideal, where the EU anchor kind of depreciated to become the main lingua franca in daily politics. And all in all, when the relations with the EU and relations with Europe are less about the EU conditionality, but more about the topical transactional relations in realms such as migration, energy, environment, whatever have you, right? So the Europeanization is usually taken in this respect in case of Turkey. And if we think about the Europeanization as the reduction of Turkey-EU relations to only some topics like migration, and emergence of Turkey not as a candidate country, but as a third country, at least at the practical level, then we could talk about the Europeanization tendency. But I never think that a thorough Europeanization and overall wholesale de-Europeanization is the case with the Turkish politics, even with Erdogan's these strategic movements, right? Because de-Europeanization means that you are basically changing the whole orientation, the whole foreign policy orientation of the country, which is not really the case. Okay, I mean, the current government, Erdogan, is increasingly having personal and political ties with countries like Russia and China. But I wouldn't say that, at least from a public opinion perspective, I wouldn't say that this would lead to a wholesale de-Europeanization. I mean, I wouldn't say that links with countries like Russia and China are substitutes of the relations with Europe. I mean, okay, there are so many developments in case of Turkey. I mean, Turkey getting away from the EU rule of law ideals. Even, I mean, Turkey's withdrawal from Istanbul Convention. So, from a broader perspective as well. But if we think about the foreign policy relations with Balkan countries, with Russia, with China, with the third countries, we could still see that these relations are revolving around European concepts like democracy, civil society, economic and investments, right? So I think no political leader in Turkey would take the political burden of detaching Turkey from this ideal, even if there would be so many divergences from time to time. So my answer is yes. I mean, there are so many Europeanization tendencies in terms of the shifting of the European ideal and context, but I wouldn't think that these would lead to a wholesale Europeanization.
Maybe we could have a look on this sources of this what you mentioned now, the tendencies to de-Europeanize Turkey in terms of the domestic, let's say, in the terms of appliance of the models which European Union is representing, or which is self-representing. Isn't it so? Maybe for Turkey as a country which is having specific history, specific, let's say, civilizational profile. Even I am not a believer that European Union means Europe. I believe I don't like this because it's not true. The European Union doesn't mean Europe. Europe is much more diverse, and Turkey is part of it, in my opinion. But put this aside. Do you think that the current, this ideal of European Union, Europeanization, which European Union is pushing, is it enough pluralistic in its contents? Doesn't it itself pushes the countries like Turkey towards this de-Europeanization trend in itself? I mean, isn't it actually quite imitative model which is offering to the different societies and maybe not offering them enough space to develop themselves?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, when we think about the conceptual toolkit of Europeanization, and when it started in the 1990s, it had emerged as a concept to point out to the convergence of the member states to the European level in terms of their polities and politics and policies, right? So this was kind of the first generation, so to speak, Europeanization studies. But when we come to the context of late 1990s, and when we have the Central and Eastern European countries returning back to Europe, and when we have the neighborhood countries, and those countries which will prospectively be EU candidates, the so-called second generation Europeanization studies started to take into account the transformative power of the EU, and they were rather curious on what was really happening at the domestic level. Right. So I would say that the second generation Europeanization studies started to take into account the notion of domestic starting from 1990s, just because of the concerns that you had raised. Is it only a one-way road that that some countries will emulate whatever is coming from the EU street, right? So, I mean, the second generation approach to Europeanization kind of took into account what was really happening at the domestic level and how the EU's transformative power is kind of emulated and is kind of represented at the domestic level. But still, I mean, we have to admit that this is, okay, Europeanization perhaps is not only a top down model, because the more you take into account the domestic, the more bottom up approach you are kind of employing. But at the same time, we have to admit that this is an asymmetrical relationship. Right. Let's take into account negotiations, EU negotiations. Whatever you are negotiating is not the content of the policies, but it's the timing, it is the funds that you require, etc. So I think we have to take into account that this is not a symmetrical relationship. So this asymmetricity is basically bringing into question this center-periphery relationship that we were talking about, Veronica. So how could we challenge this asymmetricity? I mean, perhaps the best way would be to increase the communication between two sides of the spectrum. Okay, this is not a symmetrical relationship. The so-called recipient countries or the emulators of the Europeanization do not really have a say in the decision-making processes, in the policy-making processes, etc. But the more you kind of strengthen the informal links, the civil society linkages, the more you could kind of challenge this asymmetricity, and you can hear the voice of the periphery in this respect. I mean, as I mentioned, the Jean Monnet network that I'm currently coordinating is named LEAP, Linking to Europe at the Periphery. So in this respect, we have to pay attention, scholarly attention, to what is really happening in the periphery, so that we could understand what we have as a social phenomenon at hand.
Okay, now we enter the second part of the talk, where we will focus a little bit more maybe on the periphery or southeastern Europe. There are the Western Balkans, which have been applying for EU membership for quite a long time, and Turkey has interests in basically all the countries in Western Balkans. But what type of Western Balkans is preferred by Turkey? European, Western Balkans which are in the EU, or Western Balkans which are outside of the EU?
Well, I would say, I mean, Turkey's perspective vis-a-vis the Balkans is very much stigmatized with this, with the former's role, with Turkey's role as a predecessor. I think this Ottoman past, these cultural linkages, these historical linkages are kind of sometimes stigmatizing, sometimes influencing from a positive perspective, the bilateral relations. This wasn't like this when Turkish Republic had been first established, because when Turkish Republic had first been established, it tried to forge relationships with the Balkan countries from a quite realist perspective, where all the nations are equals, right? So this was like this when Turkish Republic had first been proclaimed. The first rupture, so to speak, in this respect had been during the premiership of Turgut Özal, because Turgut Özal introduced a varied perspective towards the Balkans, where personal and cultural and religious links are playing an important role. And this has, of course, as you very well know, had been very much initiated and very much commenced with Erdogan's approach towards the Balkans, not only when he came to power, but before that, when he was the mayor of Istanbul, he had particular links with the Balkan countries. But when we look at these particular links with the Balkan countries, both during the premiership of Özal and during the Erdogan's premiership and presidency, we see that these relations are not very structured, are not very institutionalized, but usually leaning on the so-called different variants and different dynamics of soft power. And when we speak about soft power, we could speak about cultural affinities, we could speak about historical linkages, we could speak about economic investments, and we could speak about the personalized relationships between the leaders. In a way, so that's what we have regarding the relations between Turkey and the Balkans. So, how is the EU or how is Europe playing a role in this respect? Quite, I would say, Turkey has a perspective vis-a-vis the Balkans, irrespective of the EU, right? So, of course, European integration is a part of the Turkish perspective vis-a-vis the Balkans, and Turkey is not trying to undermine the EU perspective of the Balkan countries. On the contrary, right? I mean, but I would say the European integration or the EU is not a game changer in terms of Turkey's approach to the Balkans. So I would say Balkan countries which are EU members, EU candidates, or Balkan countries which clearly deviated from the EU ideal, this wouldn't really change a lot Turkey's perspective vis-a-vis the Balkans. But I would say that Turkey does not emerge as an alternative to the EU in the region. On the contrary, Balkan countries which are closer to the EU ideal and which would be okay with those countries becoming EU members, this is not a problem for Turkey, I would say.
Okay, there are also the so-called Eastern Balkans, which means Bulgaria and Romania, which are part of the EU. And recently, there has been some strengthening of the European tendency in their government, because we see that now that the foreign ministers of the two countries are both strongly linked to European institutions. And I was wondering, what does this mean for the relationship between these countries and Turkey? Usually they are kind of a bridge towards Turkey, but what is in fact the current dynamism of those relations between the Eastern Balkans, let's say the EU Balkans, and Turkey?
Yes, you are right, Vladimir. I mean, Romania and Bulgaria had been, I mean, with of course variations, but had been the supporters of Turkey's EU integration. I mean, especially for instance, what pops to my mind is Bulgaria's 2018 presidency. I mean, Boso really tried to forge links between the EU and Turkey. But within these relationships, we have to take into account other dynamics like NATO membership, like migration, like Balkan, like a Black Sea activism, so to speak, right? So in this respect, to be honest, I don't see Bulgaria and Romania's as game changers in terms of Turkey's EU accession. I mean, they would be with variations, with different dynamics. They are careful perspectives about Turkey's relations with the EU. But there are so many different dynamics, so many regional dynamics in this picture. So I wouldn't say that Romania's and Bulgaria's perspectives in terms of Turkey's EU accession wouldn't really change a lot, even if people change, ministers change, and governments change. Because, I mean, those two countries have their own lively problems and concerns about the EU itself, right? So I wouldn't think that Turkey would be a big game changer for those countries' perspective and vice versa.
Okay, and now finally, let's focus a little bit on Turkish politics. There was great attention towards the candidate of the opposition, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and he was very much supported by Western powers, let's say, but he lost the elections. And I guess it makes sense to ask you what is happening with his political union or tendency in Turkey right now, and what happens with their ambitions.
Well, I would say in Turkish politics currently, the opposition is silent. I think post election trauma is still continuing for the opposition parties, especially for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, which kind of actually creates a great disappointment on the part of their electorate as well. But currently, I wouldn't say that the opposition is displaying a very well planned, a very elaborately framed opposition to the current government and current presidency. So I would say that the opposition kind of created a disappointed on their electorate in that respect.
Okay, I think we concluded this interview, which our guest was Bașak Alpan, a Turkish specialist for EU-Turkey relations, and we were talking about Europeanization of Turkey, about its foreign policies, and also about the particular relations to the nearest EU neighborhood in the Balkans. I would like to remind everybody that cross-border talks are present on several platforms. You can see us on YouTube, you can listen us on SoundCloud, you can of course also follow us on several social media. For example, it's LinkedIn or Telegram, if I will mention a few of us. And I am glad that we could talk with our guest, and I am looking forward for our next interview. Have a nice day, everybody. Thank you, Bașak, for your time and for your insights in this topic.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.